Hey guys, tonight we're jumping into a story where the air smells like salt, the rats are growing suspiciously bold, and your survival odds, well, let's just say you might want to keep a little under your pillow. You're about to experience what it felt like to be alive, just barely, at the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in European history, when no one knew the word quarantine, but everyone suddenly started locking their doors and whispering prayers a little louder. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me your city and what time it is where you are. Are we together in the dark? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is an ordinary evening in your town by the sea. The sort of night where the smell of salted fish clings to every surface, and the worn cobblestones of the harbor glisten faintly under the residue of earlier rain. And you, still barely 17 and still more boy than man, are sitting in a tavern corner trying to act like you belong among the older men who speak in half-mumbled Latin and crude jokes, pretending not to listen too closely while nursing a thin ale that tastes more of rust than grain. You hear it, almost carelessly dropped into a sailor's story, spoken with the same tone as a description of storm damage or stolen cargo. Mors nigra, someone says, and while you do not understand the Latin immediately, the look it draws from the man across the table, a man with one hand and eyes too old for his face, makes you set your cup down just slightly. They speak of a port far south, where a Genoese ship docked late without permission, the crew already sick or silent, some dead still clutching the ropes. They speak of a monk who took confession from a dying man and fell into fever by morning. They speak of black swellings the size of plums under the arms, a breath that smells like rot, of a silence that descends over entire streets, as the air itself has grown afraid to move. You do not ask questions, not then, because to ask is to show you believe, and to believe is to invite the thing to enter through your doorway. But that night as you return to your quarters beside the Abbey Library, you find your fingers shaking as you ink Psalm 91. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness. And for the first time in your short, orderly life, the words feel less like comfort and more like a desperate command. When, 1 week later, a ship arrives in your own port and docks with no banner, no bell, and no call for harbor fees, the dock workers who approach it take only a single look before running. Some stumbling, some crossing themselves until their knuckles pale, and though you do not see the bodies, you hear the accounts in the churchyard the next day. Men whose tongues had blackened, whose blood pooled beneath the skin, who had, in the final hours, screamed for mothers who had been buried decades ago. The town closes fast, like a wound trying to seal. The gates are barred, the market silent. The church is open but mostly empty, and the monks in your abbey burn rosemary and myrrh with such desperation that your lungs feel coated in smoke, though none dare question whether smoke stops death any better than prayers. When Brother Lucian collapses in the refectory mid-bite, eyes wide and mouth still forming a blessing, and dies before the hour bell, you understand that this is no ordinary sickness. And when 3 more monks follow him in a single night, the abbey begins to split not in walls, but in will. Some take refuge in isolation, retreating into their cells with dried fruit and water, refusing to speak or touch or even pray aloud, while others descend into a kind of furious piety, whipping themselves with belts and chains and chanting until their voices fail, as if pain might be more convincing than faith. You, left to continue your copying work, because no one else remains to do it, find the scriptorium unbearably quiet. You write slower now, more carefully, not because you fear mistakes, but because each line might be your last, and you want to leave behind something orderly when the world itself seems to be collapsing into chaos. When the abbot himself dies, found kneeling before the altar, face pale and expression unreadable, you are the one to write his name in the monastery's record, and for a moment your hand hesitates, not out of grief, but because you realize there may be no one left to record your name when your time comes. And so, 3 weeks after the ship arrived, with the abbey more mausoleum than sanctuary, You gather your ink and your psalter and a loaf of hard bread and walk away, not out of courage, but out of the need to breathe air that does not smell of death. In town, the streets are mostly empty, though now and then you glimpse someone watching from a window or darting down an alley with a bundle wrapped tight to their chest. And the silence is not peace, but anticipation, as if the city itself is holding its breath and waiting to see who survives. You find a house with an unlatched door and no signs of movement, and inside there are blankets and onions and clean water and, most importantly, no corpses. So you stay, not because it is safe, but because there is nowhere safer. You do not light candles, because someone said fire draws it near. You do not speak, because no one is listening. You eat only what you must, and sleep only when exhaustion forces you. And yet, somehow, you do not die. And in the second week of isolation, when the sun rises pale and bloodless through the fog over the rooftops, and no birds sing, you find yourself sitting by the window with a piece of charcoal, writing not scripture, not doctrine, but something like a letter and something like a map, a memory of where you were when everything familiar began to vanish, and a sketch of how the world begins again, not in ceremony or command, but in the quiet act of someone deciding, despite the odds, to write it down. You remember the first time the funeral bell rang, without anyone answering its echo, not even the barefoot friar who used to lead morning prayers in a voice so cracked and weary that it often felt like the dead could hear it better than the living. And as you stood beside the chapel with others, men gripping their hats, women holding handkerchiefs to their mouths, children strangely quiet, you expected, as you always had, that the wooden doors would creak open and a thin figure in white would step out with incense, holy water, and a book that had more bookmarks than blank spaces. But that morning, the door stayed closed. No one came. The widow of the man laid out on the cart, wrapped in sheets but still leaking from his nose and ears, looked around not with panic, but with disbelief, as if the sky itself had decided not to rise. And then, slowly, people began to step back, one by one, some murmuring that perhaps the priest was sick, others whispering that maybe the funeral could wait a day, though deep down, everyone knew that if the priest had not come now, he would not be coming at all. By evening, the body was still there, the cart now swarmed with flies and flanked by two nervous dogs who alternated between sniffing and growling, and it was then that one of the grave diggers, an old man missing several teeth in all patience, muttered that they might as well bury the poor bastard themselves, priest or no priest, because by dawn there'd be 3 more like him and no one left to dig. The burial was short, joyless, and silent, except for the sound of shovel against rock and the widow's dry heaving behind a tree. From that day on, the rhythm of death no longer waited for ceremony. At first, people tried to pretend the priests were simply overwhelmed, that they would return once things quieted, once there were fewer bodies or more certainty or less fear. But the truth settled in like mildew, sticky, quiet, and hard to scrub away. You heard whispers that some clergy had fled the cities entirely, riding out in carts marked with crosses, and escorted by guards who swore to protect God's servants, though everyone could see that what they were really protecting was the ability to breathe, without gagging, and sleep without the screams of the dying echoing through stone walls. Other priests had stayed, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of stubbornness, and many of them were among the first to die, because they were the ones touching foreheads slick with sweat, hearing final confessions through veils that filtered no plague, and pressing coins into mouths that had already stopped tasting. Soon, the townspeople stopped knocking on the rectory doors altogether, because there was no answer and no hope in waiting, and began bearing their own, sometimes with prayer, often without, relying instead on whispered apologies, remembered verses, or simply the act of closing a grave as tightly as possible and walking away without looking back. You watched as religion, once the sturdy tent beneath which all grief found shade, began to fray along its seams. It was not that people ceased to believe in God, for belief clings hardest when the world is most fragile. But they began to wonder what kind of God required silence from his messengers when screams filled the streets, what kind of divine plan involved children dying faster than sparrows fall, and whether holiness was truly found in vestments and bells, or perhaps now in soap, distance, and luck. The city's great cathedral, once the anchor of civic life, stood mostly empty, its candles burning lower each day, its statues acquiring dust and pigeons in equal measure. The confessionals were closed, the fonts were dry, and the choir loft, where voices had once risen like sunlight through stained glass, echoed only when a draft managed to shake loose a beam. And when you entered it once, just to be sure it was still there, your footsteps rang too loud, and you backed out quickly, unsure whether you were trespassing against God or memory. In time, new figures began to replace the missing priests. Some were monks from smaller orders who arrived late and stood awkwardly at graves with hands folded and faces pale, uncertain whether their prayers still had weight. Others were townspeople who had once been scoffed at for their eccentricities, women, book learners, former soldiers, even grave diggers, who now stood confidently beside the dead and spoke of peace and rest in cycles, not damnation or sin. You recall the day you saw a young girl, barely 12, recite Psalm 23 by heart at her mother's burial, not weeping, not faltering, but holding a stolen rosary like it was a sword. And in that moment you understood that religion was not disappearing, but shifting, slowly and without permission, away from altars and toward hands that still worked and hearts that still beat. The funerals became shorter, more practical, less concerned with spiritual destination, and more focused on making sure the corpse stayed buried. The dogs stayed away, and the mourners didn't fall ill before the next sunset. Death had become a matter of logistics. And logistics, it turned out, could survive even without Latin. You did not attend every burial. You stopped attending most. It wasn't fear that kept you away, though fear was everywhere, but rather the exhaustion of witnessing grief played on loop, always with fewer notes, always with more silence between them. Instead, you returned to your copying, though now the psalms fell hollow and the parchment too thin, and you began writing names on scraps. Neighbors, friends, familiar strangers who used to sell onions or sharpen knives, or play the lute in the alley on summer nights. You began to realize that recording death might matter more than sanctifying it. And when one day someone asked you, softly from across a courtyard, whether you could say a few words at their brother's grave, you nodded before you even understood why. And the words you spoke were not liturgical, not formal, but they were real, and afterward the family thanked you, and no one questioned your lack of robes. So now, when the bell rings, if it rings at all, it does so without summoning anything but memory, and the people gather they choose, and the grave is dug if someone has the strength. And the prayers spoken may be short, strange, or entirely silent, but they happen, and they are enough. The priests stopped coming to the funerals, but the dead were still buried, and the living, somehow, kept finding ways to mark the loss, even when no one was left to explain how. You had never seen so many people moving at once, not for pilgrimage, not for war, but for something far less noble and far more terrifying, escape. One by one, families abandoned homes, shops, farms, and guild halls, not with banners or trumpets, but with sacks of bread, children on shoulders, and eyes that refused to look back. The roads, once reserved for merchant wagons and royal processions, became rivers of displaced, each carrying with them not just possessions, but stories, grief, and the fear that still clung to their skin like ash. At first, you thought it was temporary. You told yourself they would return after a week, maybe two, when the air cleared or the rumors faded, when the bells stopped tolling and the smell of death no longer clung to the well stones. But they didn't come back, and more followed them, craftsmen from the edge of town, servants from noble houses, scribes from chancelleries, some on foot, others in carts. All of them moving with the urgency of those who had seen death too closely and had no faith in walls to stop it. You watched a merchant once known for his stinginess offer his last coin for a mule, only to be refused because the stable boy had already run off with the beast at dawn. You saw a mother tie 3 children together with a rope, so they wouldn't be separated in the crowd. You heard a man whisper to his wife, "If we die, at least not here." What surprised you most was how quickly the city emptied. The plague had moved faster than language, and so had the people. You followed eventually, Not because you wanted to, but because staying began to feel like volunteering for your own burial. The monastery had grown too quiet, the bells too frequent, and even the walls, once thick with prayer, had begun to sweat with something more than candle smoke. So you packed what you could carry, a psalter, a bit of salt pork, 2 candles, a knife with a cracked handle, and joined the flow, not knowing where it led. Only that forward felt less fatal than stillness. The road outside the city had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where once there had been grassy shoulders and lazy oxen paths, now there were makeshift camps cooking fires, and the sound of hundreds of feet trying not to be heard. People walked in clusters, families, guildmates, strangers thrown together by urgency, and spoke little, if at all. There was no map, only instinct, and that instinct told them to go away from the bells, away from the closed shutters, away from the plagued pits that grew wider by the hour. You passed entire villages that sealed their gates and posted messages in chalk. No entry. We are clean. One town had dug a trench across the road and set fire to the bridge. Another had stationed armed men who shouted warnings and brandished clubs. Even in the fields, farmers watched with suspicion, scythes in hand, unwilling to sell their grain, unwilling to touch your coins. It was not just cities that feared collapse. The countryside, once imagined as a place of refuge, had begun to fortify itself like a wounded animal. Yet people kept moving. Some went south, chasing rumors of clean air and distant abbeys untouched by sickness. Others turned north, seeking colder winds or the promise of fishing villages far from infected roads. A few wandered in circles, too afraid to stop, too ashamed to go home. You met a girl who claimed to be 12 but had the eyes of someone 4 times that age. She walked alone and said she was looking for her uncle, though she could not remember his name. You met an elderly weaver who refused to remove his tools from his cart, saying, "If I die working." You walked beside a silent priest who no longer gave blessings, only bread. In every group, there were rumors that the next town was safe, that the king had declared a quarantine zone, that some valley was protected by saints or springs or science. And every time those rumors proved false, the walkers did not curse the lie. They simply kept walking. By the second week, you realized that motion itself had become the new religion. If you stopped too long, fear returned. If you sat too long, someone beside you might start coughing. If you stayed too long, the dead might find you. And so, even when you found a meadow with spring and no footprints, you stayed only one night. Even when you met a group who offered song and shelter, you left before dawn. Even when your feet bled and your food spoiled, you moved, because stillness now meant surrender. But movement had its price. The road took more than it gave. Your psalter, stolen in the night. Your salt pork, eaten by dogs. Your candle, melted under the sun. You lost a tooth, 3 toenails, and the names of several companions. You stopped marking the days. You forgot the name of the city you had left. You no longer dreamed. And yet, somewhere along the way, the fear changed. It softened, not because the plague was gone, but because motion had wrapped your terror in routine. Walk, drink, watch, sleep, walk again. You became something not quite pilgrim, not quite refugee, not quite man, but something else, something quieter, something that could survive. Eventually, you reached a village that did not turn you away. They let you bathe in the river. They let you sit near their fires, though not too close. They gave you turnips and said little. No one asked where you had come from. No one asked where you were going. In that silence, you felt safer than you had in months. And as you looked around, at the farmers who had taken in 3 other strangers, at the children who watched from a distance, at the empty house they offer without explanation, you realized that even here, even now, motion had brought something other than disease. It had brought connection. It had brought witnesses. It had brought the possibility of starting over. By the time the physicians stopped pretending they understood the sickness, most people had already stopped asking them for answers. The plague moved faster than their remedies, laughed at their rituals, and spilled over the pages of their bestiary-laced manuals like ink that refused to dry. So the people turned elsewhere to herbs, charms, fires, leeches, silence, and sometimes madness. You remember the last time a doctor came through your district. He wore the heavy robes of a university man, carried a stick tipped with silver, and had a servant walking 3 steps behind holding a nosegay soaked in vinegar. His diagnosis came without touch, his advice without confidence. Burn your linens, hang rue by your door, pray more often. He spoke quickly and left faster. The next week, he was dead. After that, no one asked for physicians. The shops that once sold inks and remedies turned into stalls hawking miracle powders. Women with aprons full of dried herbs began holding court on street corners. One old widow, known mostly for talking to her cats, was suddenly visited by a dozen people a day because 3 of her neighbors hadn't died, and that was enough to make her a healer. You saw boys selling frog skins as talismans. You saw someone boiling wine with nails and garlic and calling it divine vapor. You saw a man rub goose fat on his chest and swear he no longer dreamed of coffins. And none of it made sense, but neither did the deaths. So people stopped asking what worked. They started asking what hadn't failed. Yet, you yourself tried things you never would have believed. You hung sage over the window. You washed your hands with vinegar and muttered psalms under your breath. You chewed bitter roots until your tongue went numb. When you heard someone say the scent of lemons repelled the devil, you crushed rinds in your sleeves and stuffed them into the rafters. The most common remedy was fire. People lit braziers in every room, filled the air with lavender and juniper, and coughed their way through meals. Some claimed the plague came through bad smells. Others said it was in the eyes of strangers. Either way, you learned to breathe shallow and never meet anyone's gaze for too long. And yet, for all your efforts, the sickness came anyway. Not always to you. Not yet. But close. Close enough to make you believe in anything. In time, the line between doctor and madman disappeared. A man with feathers in his hat and silver rings on every finger claimed he could read the pulse through a chicken's egg. Another brought a dead crow to the marketplace and said its beak had turned black because it had absorbed a demon. No one laughed, not because they believed, but because sometimes belief was the only medicine left. You met a woman who claimed to have drunk water from 7 rivers and now could hear which direction death was walking. You met a baker who refused to bake bread unless it was kneaded under the moonlight. You met a child who could name every person who had died on his street, and no one dared question him because he'd been right too many times. And through it all, the physicians, those who remained, retreated into silence or fled to mountain towns, or wrote desperate letters to universities that no longer answered, or began studying blood in bowls, trying to find patterns in clots, like monks reading tea leaves in reverse. Eventually, the streets created their own order. If you had a remedy, you shared it. If it worked once, it was written on walls. If someone survived, their sweat was collected and saved. You watched a man become a local authority simply because his wife recovered after being wrapped in sheepskin and lemon balm. You watched a butcher become a saint because he carved his cuts in the shape of crosses. You watched a tanner become a monster because his customers kept dying, even though it had nothing to do with him. Probably. Truth no longer mattered. Only repetition. Only pattern. Only hope. What astonished you most was not the chaos, but the confidence with which people embraced it. Even in the absence of science, they built systems. They made lists. They drew signs. They ranked herbs and marked houses, and recorded dreams. They held meetings where no one touched, shared stories about cats, comets, colors, or coughs, and swore they had found the key. And maybe they had, because some lived. Some always lived, and no one knew why. So you began to listen more closely, to how people phrased their stories, to what survivors ate, to what homes smelled like, to what dogs avoided. You began to take notes, not as a scholar, but as a gambler, because every new trick might be the one that bought you another week. You stopped thinking of healing as certainty. You started thinking of it as improvisation, like music hummed while fleeing, like cooking without recipes, like prayer spoken in the wrong language but still somehow heard. And the city, what was left of it, began to sound like that too. A chorus of contradictions, a murmur of half-truths, a patchwork of rituals stitched with thread and fear. But it was still living, somehow, still trying. And that, more than any doctor's oath, felt like medicine. When the bailiffs stopped showing up, when the judges stopped calling sessions, and when no one remembered the last time a fine had actually been paid or a contract enforced, it became clear that the law, once slow but dependable, had quietly stopped breathing. What replaced it was not chaos, exactly, but something more dangerous: improvisation. At first, it was small. Disputes that would have once gone to court about land boundaries, debts, or accusations of stolen livestock were now settled with words in alleys or fists in barns. A baker accused a neighbor of poisoning his flour. There was no trial, just a broken jaw and an unspoken agreement that the matter was over. A widow tried to reclaim her dowry from her late husband's cousin and was told, flatly, that she could take what she could carry and not a coin more. You saw these changes not all at once, but in patterns. The town criers stopped announcing court dates. The scribes stopped copying writs. The wax on legal seals dried out in unopened cabinets. You had always assumed that even when the world seemed to drift, someone was still counting crimes, still tabulating fees, still recording who owed whom what. But the clerk's bench was empty. The jailhouse was locked, not to keep people in, but because the constable had taken the only key and disappeared. No one was collecting bribes because there was no one left to bribe. And when you found an abandoned ledger in the corner of a storeroom with names and debts carefully inscribed in faded ink, you realized no one would ever come to settle them. With no one to enforce the law, people began to invent their own. You heard of villages posting handwritten lists of permitted guests at their entrances. You heard of crossroads where tolls were demanded not by taxmen, but by men with clubs. You saw messages carved into wood. We guard our own. And you saw men, former farmers, journeymen, even children, patrolling fields with sharpened tools and eyes too tired for mercy. One day, you pass a house marked with an X. Not the red X of disease, but a charcoal one, angled and deliberate. You asked what it meant. The woman beside you whispered, "That man cheated a dying woman, took her bread and her rings. His door won't open again." You weren't sure she meant that as prophecy or warning. You weren't sure which would be worse. In towns where officials still remained, they became either more cautious or more cruel. Some retreated behind walls, issuing proclamations from windows and refusing to touch the parchment once it left their hands. Others turned to harshness, hoping fear would do what order no longer could. Public beatings, food confiscation, summary exile for anyone who seemed too sick or too foreign or too loud. One magistrate hanged a thief without trial, left the body swinging from a church steeple, and no one questioned it. Not because they agreed, but because no one dare become next. You wondered who exactly kept the peace now. It wasn't the sheriffs. They were gone. It wasn't the clergy. They were sick. It wasn't the landowners. They had fled. It was whoever stood tallest in a given moment, whoever shouted first, whoever had something sharp and nothing to lose. The strangest part was how quickly this new system began to feel natural. You saw neighbors organize night watches, not out of civic pride, but out of survival. You saw grain hoarders dragged from cellars and forced to open their sacks, not by decree but by threat. You saw a man whip another for theft in the square, and no one stopped him, not even the thief. Maybe he thought it was fair. Maybe he knew there would be worse if he ran. Rules still existed, but they were spoken now, passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by rumor, bent by need. There were no more written laws, only living ones. And yet, even in this darkness, there were strange flickers of justice. You met a tanner who had formed a tribunal of 3 elders to hear disputes. No robes, no Latin, Just stories and memory and a consensus drawn from nods. You watched the baker repay a stolen measure of grain with 3 loaves and a bowed head. You heard of a healer who confessed to watering down remedies, then offered her own blanket to a child an apology. These were not the judgments of kings or clerics, but they held weight, perhaps more than before. Still, there were days you missed the old injustice. At least it was predictable. You could bribe it, dodge it, work around it. This new one, raw and improvised, was sharp-edged, unspoken, and always watching. You wrote less during these days. There was little point in keeping records no one would enforce. But you did begin a new notebook, not for laws, for behaviors. Who shared, who hoarded, who stood up, who looked away. You weren't a judge or a scribe or a priest. But in a time when paper courts had burned and memory had replaced decree, maybe what you noticed would be the only justice left. Maybe the rules now lived not in books, but in the mouths and minds of the ones who had survived. And maybe justice, like everything else, had learned to walk without a robe, without a bench, without a name, just a shape in the crowd, a hand on a shoulder, a voice saying, "Not today." You used to believe, as many did, that the high walls and heavy gates of noble estates held more than just wealth. They held immunity, distance, protection. That the thick drapery and perfumed halls, the private wells and tended gardens, the household physicians and hand-washed linens, all conspire to form an invisible barrier against what stalked the rest of the city. But when the servants stopped answering the door, when smoke no longer curled from the kitchens, and when the guard began to disappear one by one, it became clear. The sickness had passed through the front doors of the powerful, and it did not knock. You passed one such estate on your way to the southern market, once a place of envy, now silent. The hedges were untrimmed, the banners sagging, and the wrought iron gate, usually chained and guarded, stood ajar. A dog wandered in and out. You waited a moment, expecting someone to shoo it away, but no one did. So you walked closer. Inside, the marble was cracked where no foot had stepped for days. In the courtyard, a fountain dripped into stillness. The front door was open. You didn't go in. You didn't have to. You could smell it. Word spread quickly. Lord R. had died, along with his wife, his second son, and 3 of the kitchen staff. Only the eldest daughter remained, and she had fled in the night with 2 maids and a coach driver. No one knew where. The estate was left to the wind, to rumor, and to those who no longer feared theft because everything inside was already cursed. And it wasn't just one household. One by one, the great names of the city stopped appearing at council meetings, stopped sending carriages to the cathedral, stopped employing tailors, cooks, scribes. The very symbols of stability, landowning, patronage, heraldry, began to feel like the weight of tombstones, no longer impressive, just immovable and cold. You had always imagined the nobility would be the last to fall. Instead, they fell strangely fast. Not just to disease, but to panic, to isolation, to decisions made in the echo chambers of wealth and detachment. You heard that some nobles barricaded themselves in their manors with months of provisions and never stepped out. Others fled to the countryside, only to bring the plague with them and be turned away by their own tenants. One duke tried to sail with his household across the channel, but half his crew fell ill before the first tide, and the rest were burned on shore by a frightened port town. Some begged for spiritual protection. Some bribed their doctors to stay. Some demanded their staff be flogged for impurity or inviting demons. None of it worked, because the sickness didn't care for gold, didn't care for titles, didn't care for prayers offered in Latin or Old French, or the dialect spoken in marble halls. What struck you most was not their fall, but the silence of it. No bells tolled for their deaths. No funerals were held. No long black processions filed through the city. They died behind closed doors, sometimes in beds with a dozen feather layers, sometimes on stone floors stained with wine and blood, and something no one dared name. They died clutching rings or letters or no one at all, and their names faded faster than expected. It wasn't irreverence. It was exhaustion, There were too many dead to mourn, and even the richest names lost their weight when there were no voices left to speak them aloud. One day, you passed a boy no older than 10, wearing a coat too fine for the street. He held it close, eyes hollow, lips chapped, shoes missing. When asked who he belonged to, he whispered a name that once ruled half the eastern trade routes. Now, he belonged to no one, not even the house he came from. And in that moment, you realized something had shifted. The ladder of status had collapsed not from the top down, but from every rung at once. It was not that the nobles had been dragged down to the level of commoners. It was that status itself had become weightless, like ash. In the weeks that followed, you watched former servants take up residence in abandoned estates, not to steal, but to survive. A cook became caretaker. A seamstress lit candles in salon, once reserved for ambassadors. A gardener harvested from his dead master's orchard and gave half the fruit to the poor. No one objected. There was no one left to object. And even those who might have, those who once called themselves lord or lady, had other concerns now, like whether their third fever would be their last, or whether their heir was still breathing in another province, or whether the priest would come this time, or just send a bucket of holy water with a note. You began to wonder what nobility meant when no one bowed anymore, what it meant when letters went unanswered, when seals cracked and peeled, when the tapestries of lineages grew mold on walls no one had time to clean. You passed estates where the lions of family crests had been scratched off by desperate hands trying to open shutters from the inside. You heard that a viscount's was contested by 4 distant cousins, none of whom survived to see it read. And slowly, a different kind of power emerged. The power to be remembered. The power to share. The power to organize when no one else did. You met a butcher who could calm crowds. A widow who rationed grain with fairness and resolve. A midwife who buried 27 strangers and marked every name. These were not noble by birth, but in a world stripped of ceremony, they were the ones still standing, still breathing, still holding something that resembled authority, not by decree, but by necessity. And in your quietest moments, you wondered if history would remember them instead. If, centuries from now, the records that survived would name the caretakers, not the kings. If the houses that mattered were not those built in stone, but those carried in acts, in choices, in hands that reached out and did not close into fists. If nobility had never been a birthright at all, only an action, a decision, a moment that chose not to retreat behind gates, but to open them when no one else would. You first noticed a change when you passed a cottage that had always been locked, its shutters sealed and its garden brambled over. Now, the door swung open, and a new family stood inside, sweeping, planting, whispering. No one asked where they came from. No one demanded a deed. The plague had erased the old rules, and in their place grew a new one. If no one else lives here, maybe you can. At first, it felt like trespassing. You remember walking by empty manors, houses where lamps once burned behind thick curtains, and dogs barked from behind fences. The dogs were gone now. The fences had collapsed. The windows were open. Inside, the tables were still set. The floors were dusty, but not yet ruined. And outside, people began to look with new eyes, not as mourners, but as seekers. Not of inheritance, of shelter, of chance. You met a man who had moved his family into a stone mill house abandoned after the owner, and all his sons had perished. He didn't knock. He simply waited. When no one came for 3 weeks, he lit a fire on the hearth and swept the ashes of the dead into a jar. He carved new initials over the lintel. He said, "If they come back, I'll move out." But no one ever did. You saw a girl tilling land that once belonged to a monastery orchard. She didn't ask the monks. There were no monks left. She planted onions and potatoes and said nothing to anyone. People began to leave her offerings, bread, water, a spool of thread, not as tribute, but as thanks. They didn't ask who owned the land. They asked what she grew. The old hierarchy of ownership, built over generations, enforced by seal and sword and oath, simply dissolved. Deeds crumbled, ledgers burned, guardians died, and into that vacuum rushed need. A family without shelter chose a house with a roof. A man without land chose a patch with sunlight. A widow without food chose a barn with chickens. And no one stopped them, because there was no one left to stop them. Because for the first time, property didn't mean possession. It meant presence. If you were there, it was yours. Of course, not everyone agreed. You heard of heirs returning from distant towns to find their ancestral halls occupied by strangers. Some fought, some wept, some simply turned away, unsure whether the place even recognized them anymore. You saw arguments erupt at marketplaces over whether a certain mule had belonged to a dead trader or had been freely taken when the barn collapsed. One woman claimed the orchard she tended was always hers, though no one remembered her family name. Another accused a neighbor of stealing her brother's boots, only to be told, "Your brother gave them to me before he died." Truth became negotiable. Memory replaced law. And in the end, survival rewrote the record books. You yourself stood one day before a cottage with a half-fallen roof, vines choking the shutters, and a door hanging from one hinge. You walked through. There were no voices, no movement, a broken chair, a stained blanket, a bowl with a single blackened coin. You swept the floor. You lit a fire. You slept. No one came. So you stayed. And in that staying, you became something else, not an owner, not a thief, but something between a caretaker of the world left behind. You began to understand how easily place detaches from pedigree, how quickly the line between mine and ours can blur. You saw people erect fences not to keep others out, but to mark where weeds had been pulled. You saw strangers repaint doorframes, not to hide what had been lost, but to declare, "Someone is here now." The streets whispered different kinds of questions. Who live there now? Do they have bread? Can I help? Can I stay? In the outer villages, entire blocks were rebuilt by hands that had no title, no permission, no legacy, just tools, time, and determination not to live in ruins. New names were painted on old gates. New children learned to walk in courtyards, once swept by servants in livery. Chickens nested where cats used to sleep. Apples fell into unfamiliar baskets. And the wind blew through homes that had forgotten how to echo. Some called it theft. Others called it fate. Most called it necessary. You met a boy who lived in a manor stable with his grandmother. He said the main house was haunted. You met a woman who had turned a collapsed bakery into a garden. You met a group of travelers who lit candles every evening in a chapel they had never prayed in before because they liked the sound of footsteps on stone. None of them had keys, but all of them had staying power. And somewhere along the way, you stopped worrying whether the past would prove. You stopped wondering who would claim the field you had planted or the floor you had swept. You stopped counting blessings in coin or title and began measuring them in warmed silence and the lack of a cough in the room next door. Because you knew what it meant to have nothing. And now you had something. Not forever. But for now, you first noticed in the marketplace, not in books. A man selling apples had painted a sign not in Latin, but in the common tongue, roughly spelled, brightly colored, and instantly understood. Then came the songs. Children chanting rhymes about death, survival, saints, and shadows, not in church language, but in the rhythms of the street. At first, it felt like a reverence. Then, it felt like a new kind of truth. You had been raised to believe that proper words wore robes. That knowledge came in Latin. That anything worth remembering had to be spoken as if whispered by monks or recorded by scribes hunched under candlelight, scraping ink across sheepskin. But Latin required schooling. It required someone to teach you the silence between syllables. And after the plague, most of those teachers were gone. The priests who once translated the world into sacred words had died. The scholars who once guarded the libraries had fled. The clerks who once wrote your village taxes had stopped sending ledgers because no one was left to read them. And so, the people began to write for themselves in the only language they had left. Their own. You saw it on walls first. Scrawled prayers, scratched warnings, and declarations of love or vengeance, written in rough, uneven spelling, full of invented letters and missing grammar. God help me stay breathless no more. Don't drink from this well. He lies here, he was kind. They were not elegant, but they were loud, and they stayed. You saw children carve names into fence posts with knives. You saw a widow write her husband's final words on the back of a butcher's bill and nail it to the church door. You saw a street singer rhyme rat with priest and get a crowd to laugh. Suddenly, language was not a gate, it was a bridge. It connected grief to memory. It made space for people who had never been taught to speak formally, but who had always known what they want to say. A shepherd began keeping a journal. A carpenter began recording the days since his wife died. A midwife began copying recipes for teas that soothed coughing children, not in Latin, but in the way her mother had said them, half song, half spell, all care. You started to listen differently. You started to write differently. You stopped worrying whether the sentence was correct. You started asking whether it was real. Even the church, wounded and scattered, began to notice. With so many priests dead, surviving ones had to preach in whatever words they could gather, and more often, those were not Latin. Sermons started sounding like tavern tales. Confessions became stories. Psalms were sung off-key, but remembered because they rhymed with the way your grandmother used to scold you. One Sunday, a boy read the gospel aloud in the town square, not because he was trained, because he had a voice. And when he stumbled on the word for salvation, he replaced it with safety. No one corrected him. No one needed to. You watched as people who had never held a pen began making records. Not because they were historians, but because they were afraid to forget. They wrote letters no one would send. They drew maps to places that no longer had names. They wrote lists of neighbors who had lived, died, vanished. You helped bury a man who had written, "I was here on the beams of his attic before he died alone." It felt like a monument. It felt more honest than any Latin epitaph. And the songs, oh, the songs, how they spread. Children made up chants about death carts and coughing, about who survived and who didn't, about where the safest water was, and which alley had the singing woman with the violet scarf. These songs traveled faster than scribes ever could. No parchment, no approval, just memory passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by rhythm and fear and hope. A girl sang one at a burial. A mother hummed it while boiling herbs. You found yourself muttering it under your breath. You no longer cared that it didn't rhyme in Latin. It rhymed with your life. Even contracts changed. With fewer notaries, fewer priests, and no more reliable scribes, people began making their own agreements, drawn on scraps of cloth, burned into wood, scratched into coins. A handshake meant more than a seal. A witness was whoever was still breathing. And if you could write, you wrote in the words you knew, because there was no one left to correct you, and no time to wait for the right words. What mattered was that someone would read it, someday, and understand. You remember once being told that Latin was immortal, that it would outlive kings and plagues and storms. And maybe it still would, but as you looked around at the chalked words on doors, the hymns made from whispers, the recipes passed in baskets, the notes tucked into graves, you realized that immortality had a rival, accessibility, and love, because the words people chose now were not meant to impress the dead. They were meant to comfort the living. They were meant to remember the names. They were meant to keep the world from going silent. You had never envisioned a life in which your hands would thread a loom, align bricks in a wall, or stir a boiling mixture of herbs intended to soothe relentless coughs and break stubborn fevers. Such vocations had seemed distant, even abstract, as your younger self was destined, or so you thought, to inherit tales, beliefs, and quiet legacies rather than tools, blueprints, or recipes. Yet when the skilled, those patient and disciplined individuals who had spent entire lifetimes perfecting the craft of steel bending, timber carving, and the delicate balance of word and silence, were no longer among the living, the world, in its usual indifference, failed to pause or accommodate the vacuum their absence created. And so, you did what the times demanded. You learned not through structured teachings or dusty volumes carefully annotated in Latin, but through a patchwork of impressions and recollections. Perhaps a half-remembered glimpse of your uncle's fingers folding fabric with a precision only familiarity brings. Perhaps a set of scribbled instructions hidden in a drawer you were once forbidden to open. Perhaps a neighbor's hushed explanation, delivered like sacred truth, distinguishing between a flower that purifies and one that poisons. What pushed you forward was never prestige or ambition, but urgency, because the loom stood silent, the patience writhed without relief, the rooftop sagged ominously toward collapse. And none of these things could wait for credentials to be issued or apprenticeships to resume. The old order, built upon decades of rigid expectations, 7 years under a master's gaze, followed by another decade of sanctioned practice, entry into the right guild, validation from above, bent and eventually broke, not with ceremony but with quiet finality, as the masters were gone, their shops shuttered, and their halls echoing only with absence. Left with no official sanction and no guiding voice, you picked up discarded tools, whispered questions to surviving neighbors, and allowed your hands to clumsily explore territories they had never been taught to touch, producing seams that wandered, bricks that split, loaves that refused to rise. But even then, surrounded by failures, no one scoffed or reprimanded, because nearly everyone around you was likewise fumbling through unfamiliar crafts once deemed outside their birthright. It became impossible not to see this transformation everywhere you looked. The boy who taught his younger siblings to mold clay into usable bowls because no potter remained. The soldier who turned to sewing, not as reinvention, but as a desperate necessity to patch his comrades' cloaks. The nun who, lacking physicians, set bones and whispered blessings she hoped might double as painkillers. Their roles weren't promotions, and their efforts weren't replacements for those lost. They were, quite simply, acts of survival, tendered in trembling hands and urgent repetition, passed from breath to breath like barely salvaged fire. You encountered a teenager who, due only to his memory of the alphabet, served as his village's entire correspondence system. A widow who spun thread late into each evening despite, having never touched fiber before the plague, took her husband and her livelihood. An apprentice blacksmith, still too young to grow a beard, forging weapons that would never be considered masterworks, but would nevertheless cleave with meat and doubt in equal measure. The pursuit of perfection was abandoned, and in its place emerged a new reverence for the simply functional. Even the weakened remnants of guild authorities attempted, in vain, to reassert their vanished order, sending missives proclaiming your textiles unlawful, your dyes inferior, your designs unsanctioned, but you read such letters as kindling, burning them in your hearth, not in rebellion, but because no regulatory threat could compete with the need to keep your children warm. Soon, the social structure surrounding skilled labor evolved into something unrecognizable compared to what had come before, not systems built upon status and seniority, but networks formed out of collective learning, willingness to fail, and the stubborn generosity of those who now understood that information hoarded could cost lives. Instead of secrecy, you found sharing. Instead of silence, instruction. Your neighbors and you compared notes not for credit, but for results on which teas reduced fever fastest, which mortar mixtures held longest in the rain, which grain fermented best in humid storage. And none of it was about pride anymore. It was about continuity. It was about care. Villages adopted new rhythms not dictated by guilds or tax edicts, but by lived necessity. The home with a steady oven became the baker's, even if its inhabitant had never measured flour until last month. The girl with patience for fermentation became the brewer, and her misfires were celebrated rather than mocked. A broken blade was brought not to a name, but to a neighbor. And you, who once would have claimed no profession, found yourself standing in 3 roles at once. Healer, cook, builder, all fused into one body, moving through days that no longer asked what you were trained for, but what you could tempt. You once accepted a hand-stitched cloak from a girl whose fingers still trembled from inexperience, and when you asked whether someone had taught her, she replied softly, "I watched my brother. He died, but I remembered." It draped awkwardly, but warmly, and you understood that this, more than anything, was what inheritance had become. An act repeated, a memory clung to, a necessity reborn through will alone. Later, while clearing a collapsed cottage, you stumbled upon a half-burned book, its Latin obscured by smoke, its margins inked with drawings you didn't understand. And yet beside those cryptic scrawls, someone had written rough translations in the tongue you spoke daily, instructions on how to brew pine sap, and salt into a balm for cracked skin and swollen joints. You tried it. It worked. You copied the recipe anew, and beneath it wrote only, "From my hands to yours." The world had, undeniably, lost its masters. But what remained was something more accessible, if less adorned. A culture built not around credentials, but around the courage to begin. Not around excellence, but around endurance. And you, who once thought skills were reserved for the chosen, now knew, with a kind of aching clarity, that in the absence of teachers, the brave would become the builders. Before the plague, you worked because you were told to, because your father had done so, and because there was always another man behind you, ready to take your place if you faltered, fell sick, or dared to ask for more than what had been given to your grandfather's grandfather. After the plague, something fundamental shifted, not in an explosion, not in every town at once, but like a tide you couldn't ignore once it started to rise. The whispers about wages stopped, and in their place came voices, measured at first, then louder, then undeniable, voices that began to say not, "I will serve, but if you want my hands, here is my price." You first noticed it at the fields. A man you'd known since childhood, a thin, bent figure who had never once spoken above a murmur to the landowner, stood still at the edge of a furrow, his tools clean, his sleeves rolled, and said, "Double." The steward blinked. "Pardon?" "Double." The man said again, not cruelly, not greedily, but simply, "Double or find someone else." There was no one else. So he was paid. It happened again and again. The baker refused to light the oven for last year's coin. The plowman named a fee for every morning. The washerwoman, whose hands had always worked in silence, now paused before lifting a sheet and asked, "What will you give?" These were not threats. They were facts. And the world, for the first time, had an answer. You had never seen lords look so bewildered. They paced halls that once echoed with command and now rattled with uncertainty. They rode out to villages with promises of security and grain, only to be met with arms crossed and questions asked. "Will you pay more? Will you let my son keep the pigs? Will you write it down?" What once had been service became negotiation. What once had been order became barter. In the chaos of disease, the people who had long been called replaceable had become rare, and rare things become valuable. You heard of statutes, drafted in haste and trembling hands, meant to freeze wages where they had once been, declaring that no man should earn more than before, no matter the scarcity, no matter the danger, no matter the absence of 10 others who might once have stood beside him. In England, they nailed the words to church doors and called it law. In France, they sent messengers on horseback to remind the peasants of God's hierarchy. In Italy, they posted guards beside the grain barns to scare workers back into humility. But the laws could not fill bellies. The guards could not harvest wheat. The proclamations, proud, ornate, and sealed with wax, could not mend the tools or lift the dead. You saw men laugh at the laws. Not out of disrespect, but disbelief. You heard a woman say, "I will clean your floors, but not for the price of shroud." You yourself, when offered last year's coin for twice the labor, answered not with anger, but with quiet certainty. "I have lived through plague. I will not starve through recovery." And slowly, even the masters began to nod, not because they agreed, but because they had no one else. You witnessed a village rewrite its own rules. One man took only bread as payment, but demanded the right to eat with the family. Another accepted coin, but insisted on Sunday rest. A third refused to serve any household that had turned beggars away during the worst weeks. Choices once unthinkable now stood firm on dusty roads and muddy thresholds. And with each negotiation, a new kind of memory began to take root. The memory of not being owned. The memory of refusing. The memory of knowing that labor, once invisible, had become the thing that turned the world. You heard children shout, "We don't work for free," while stacking firewood. You saw a widow, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, demand her son's wages be paid in advance. You saw yourself, not as someone grateful for employment, but as someone whose presence meant bread could be baked, barns could be filled, lives could be rebuilt. One morning, you walked past a manor's gate, and a steward called out, "Not come here, but would you consider?" You turned, and for the first time, weighed the offer not as a subject, but as a citizen of a changed world. You said, "What's the pay?" and waited. Later, someone would say the plague gave birth to rebellion. That's not what you felt. What you felt was clarity. The clarity of scythe in your hand, and the knowledge that no field sowed itself. The clarity of being wanted, not because of title or family name, but because you were breathing and able and awake. The clarity of knowing your time, your body, your effort, once presumed free, now had weight. You had heard sermons all your life about humility. Now, you heard a different gospel, one spoken the way a man folded his arms before agreeing, in the way a woman let silence stretch before accepting coin. A gospel that said, "You need me, and I know it." In the wake of the plague, during a time when entire systems strained to reassemble their broken parts, there was a near-frantic determination among monarchs whose courts echoed with absence, bishops whose cathedrals had lost both their choirs and their congregations, landowners whose fields had become as empty as their tenant rolls, and magistrates whose cities rang less with bells and with silence, to restore not only the visible framework of society, but the invisible contract that had long kept it together. A contract not written in ink, but in submission, in rhythm, in the unquestioned continuity of things. They ordered that fields be sown according to ancient calendars, that rents be demanded in the same coin and weight, that processions march under banners now faded by neglect but held aloft nonetheless, and that the mechanisms of justice resume from pulpits and benches, as if nothing had shifted, but what they reassembled was not a resurrection, only a reconstruction, for what had been lost was not merely the bodies of the dead, but the obedience of the living. You recognized it not in open defiance, but in the subtlety of changed posture, in the villager who bowed without bending his spine, in the woman who stepped aside for a noble's horse but kept her gaze steady, in the prayers recited aloud, yet muttered with a tone more transactional than reverent. Even when people complied, they did so with delay, with questions hanging in their eyes, and with a hush of shared glances that suggested solidarity rather than servility. When a tax collector, his robes trimmed with the remnants of institutional pride and his scrolls sealed with the authority of distant hands, arrived in your village and opened his mouth to recite decrees that once would have bent necks before they reached ears, he was interrupted, not rudely, but firmly, by a voice asking simply, "Which king?" And though no one laughed, the silence that followed stripped his words of their ritual power and left him finishing his statement with far less conviction than he began. The villagers paid, yes, but their coins fell without the weight of fear or loyalty. Elsewhere, landowners, seeking to reassert their dominion, reissued labor lists, called for tribute, and summoned tenants to reestablish the old rituals of subordination. Yet those summoned arrived late, signed their names or marks with the opposite hand, and stood in dispersed clumps rather than the kneeling lines of memory, creating a tableau that mocked the past even as it imitated it. When oaths were spoken, they came softly and sometimes incompletely. When punishments were carried out, those who witnessed them did not avert their eyes in shame or guilt, but watched with unreadable calculation, as if weighing not the crime, but the consequences of resisting or remaining. The church, too, attempted to reclaim its authority through the restoration of masses and feast days, through sermons that rang once again beneath vaulted arches. Yet it found that the bodies in the pews were fewer, their arrivals delayed, their exits early, and their songs more like echoes than convictions. When confession resumed, people spoke not with weeping but with clarity, some even with challenge, asking whether stealing bread to feed a child was still sin, or whether condemning a priest who fled while the dying remained warranted repentance. It would be misleading to call it disobedience, for what had emerged was more insidious than refusal. It was erosion, a steady thinning of the connective tissue that once bound ruler to ruled, pulpit to parishioner, master to laborer. You yourself found that the thoughts rising in your mind were not the same as before. In marketplaces, you no longer felt mere gratitude that commerce had returned. Instead, you considered who set the price, who owned the scales, and whether fairness or familiarity governed exchange. When proclamations were shouted in the square, your ears caught the words, but your heart weighed them as one might assess the forecast, not as commands, but as conditions. When someone invoked tradition by saying, "This is how we've always done it," you no longer nodded automatically. Instead, you asked quietly, "Does that still make sense?" Where once obedience had been a shield you held against chaos, a protective gesture meant to keep you safe through humility and silence. Now you saw that the plague had torn through even that illusion, and those who had lived, shivering, grieving, hardened, were no longer so eager to lower their heads. There were, of course, those who tried to hammer the world back into shape, drafting laws that fixed wages in place, and dispatched enforcers to ensure that no one dared demand more than before. They seized fields from hesitant hands and threatened those who questioned them, enforcing curfews in cities whose nights had grown too quiet and too conspiratorial. But these gestures, though loud and sometimes cruel, seemed to echo rather than land, for they targeted the behaviors of the people who no longer carried the inner habits that had once made those laws effective. You observed neighbors, once divided by jealousies and petty quarrels, now gathering behind barn walls to speak in low tones. You saw a priest remove his vestments before breaking bread with workers. You watched a nobleman press silver into a farmhand's palm and say, not as condescension, but as truth, "Thank you." The world, dressed in its old garments, looked the same in silhouette, but beneath the stitching, something fundamental had shifted. And that something spoke not in words, but in memory. We remember your absence. We remember how fast you ran. We remember that, when everything fell apart, we were the ones who stayed. So when the next round of orders came, labor mandates nailed at doors, silence decrees whispered in court, sermons on duty copied from surviving missiles, you read them not with fear, but with reflection. You looked at your hands. You remembered how they had buried bodies, carried grain, stitched torn cloth, cradled your sick, and you asked yourself not whether what was asked of you was legal, but whether it was right. Before the plague, the act of affixing one's name to a legal document, whether it marked the transfer of land, the recording of a marriage, or the pledge of loyalty to a guild, had been a gesture so steeped in ritual, hierarchy, and exclusivity that most people never imagined their hands worthy of holding a pen, let alone of guiding ink across parchment with the authority to declare ownership, intent, or identity. That privilege, like so many others in the pre-plague world, had been confined to those who had the means to be taught, the birthright to be trusted, and the proximity to power to be allowed. Clerics held the pens, scribes moved them, and nobles signed with practice flourish, while others, women, peasants, apprentices, and servants, stood on the margins, watching the script curl and seal the fate of things they could touch but not claim, witness but not alter. But after the plague, in the yawning void left by the deaths of the literate, the ordained, and the formerly empowered, a space opened, at first tentative and small, like the corner of a locked door left ajar by accident, then wider and finally undeniable, into which new hands began to reach, hesitant at first, but with growing certainty, to pick up the quill. You remember the first time you saw it, not in a cathedral or a courthouse, but in a barn, where a woman whose husband had died, without a will stood beside a steward who, lacking the time or authority to dispute her claim, handed her the parchment and said simply, "Sign it, and it's yours." And she did, though her letters were uneven and her name trembled across the page like a thing newly born. From that moment on, you noticed it everywhere. Widows signing contracts for grazing rights once held by their deceased husbands. Young men, barely past childhood, signing apprenticeship declarations without their father's presence. Midwives, once unnamed in the civic records, now signing receipts for grain, ink, tools, and even property. It was not a revolution announced by trumpet or law, but a quiet rewriting of what ink could mean. The scribes remained too few and too tired to gatekeep, taught whoever asked, sometimes for coin, sometimes for bread, and sometimes for the simple reason that if they did not, the world would drown in unprocessed claims, unsent messages, and unsigned agreements. You yourself learned the letters slowly, drawing them in dirt before daring to set them in ink, practicing with chalk on walls that had once borne only prayers and now held practice marks, initials, symbols of names not yet fully remembered. The first time you signed something, an inventory list, a marriage record, a debt forgiven, you felt not powerful but present, as if the mark you left behind proved that you had stood in a room, had spoken, had counted. Others felt it too. You saw it in the way people paused before signing, not to hesitate, but to recognize what it meant to be written into the ledger of the living. Women, especially, found themselves not only speaking more often in matters of household and trade, but also writing first their names, then small notes, then full statements, on papers that once would have passed only through male hands. A daughter signed a lease for the family cottage. A widow signed her son's guild papers. A mother signed a report of her own husband's burial. And while some try to argue that these signatures lack legitimacy, that they were born in necessity rather than right, the ink dried all the same, and the documents moved forward, unchallenged by the dead or the dwindling. For commoners, too, the signature became something it had never been before, not just a mark of identity, but a declaration of participation in a system that had previously excluded them. They were no longer only spoken for. They were now writing themselves into the architecture of society, one crooked line at a time. Even when the letters were misshapen, the meaning was clear. I was here. I saw this. I agreed. In the cities, officials began to compile new registries where the names, written in dozens of hands and spellings, showed how literacy no longer followed the lines of nobility or clergy. You once saw a contract signed by 5 people, one a carpenter, one a washerwoman, one a former monk, one a baker's boy, and one an old shepherd who had never before touched ink in his life. And each name, strange in spelling and shaky in form, had the same legal weight. The world did not crumble because the wrong people were signing. On the contrary, it held together, awkwardly but steadily, because more people now had a way to anchor themselves in writing. And what began as necessity gradually became expectation. Children were taught not just to memorize prayers, but to write their names. Brides practiced signing on spare scraps of cloth. Even farmers began marking ownership on tools and fences with initials they now understood belonged to them. And so, without announcement, without royal decree, without a formal proclamation from church or court, the act of signing transformed, not into a privilege, but into a right, not into a symbol of superiority, but into a footprint of presence in a world that had, for so long, tried to walk past those who had no names. You remember the first time someone handed you a page and said, "Sign here," and you remember the feeling as your fingers curled around the quill, not as a tool of others, but as your own, and how, for the first time in your life, you realized that what you wrote might last longer than what you said. In the years that preceded the great dying, faith, regardless of whether it was practiced in soaring cathedrals, in dusty chapels nestled between village fields, or in whispered evening prayers beneath the thatched roofs of the poor, had always reached upward, as though salvation were a ladder extended into the invisible. And those who suffer were asked not to question the pain, but to endure it, not to seek healing here, but to wait patiently for the next world, where reward and redemption would surely come. If only they could remain meek, obedient, and quiet. Salvation belonged to the afterlife. Miracles were counted only when they defied the rules of flesh. And saints were men and women so long buried that their bones were kept in golden boxes, while their memories were polished in things far too distant to speak to your daily grief. But when the plague came and lingered, and the promised intercessions failed to arrive, and the prayers offered in incense and desperation dissolved into silence that was not holy but empty, something within that certainty cracked, not as a heresy declared or a rebellion launched, but as a quiet shift in the soul that began with one unanswered prayer and widened with every mass grave filled with those who had prayed the hardest. You began to notice that faith, once pointed only heavenward, began to glance sideways, downward, inward, toward the faces of those who had stayed, those who had survived, those whose hands had touched your brow not in benediction, but in fevered care. It started with small things. A woman who had nursed her entire village was given a seat at council, though she had no lineage or land. A gravedigger, who had buried hundreds with tenderness and named everybody aloud, was given food before the priest. A young boy, orphaned and ragged, was said to be protected, not by angels, but by something holier, the collective promise that no child who had lived through this should ever be alone again. You watched the stories changed. Once, the tales most often told were of martyrs, of saints flayed and burned, of suffering embraced as sacred. Now, the stories told around fires and woven into new songs were about the midwife who refused to leave the sickbed, the blacksmith who rang his bell so people would know he still lived, the woman who shared bread from her empty shelf until the last crumb. Holiness began to look like survival, not grand, not gilded, not descending from heaven on beams of light, but rising bloodied from the mud, from the ashes, from the very places faith had once taught you to flee. You saw people begin to visit graves not just of saints but of neighbors, lighting candles not to beg miracles but to say thank you. Shrines appeared, not only inside churches, but on windowsills and barns, on old tree stumps, honoring the midwife, the shepherd, the mother who had stayed. People knelt not because the church told them to, but because grief bent their backs in real ways. And when they whispered prayers, they no longer asked only for paradise, but for warmth, for a season without death, for the strength to keep caring when the world gave no reward. You remember one morning when a man who had survived 3 waves of plague, who had carried his wife's body alone to the pit and then returned to feed her sisters, walked past the church without entering, but when a child fell nearby, he was the first to kneel, to check her breathing, to lift her gently and say, "You are still here," as though that alone was miracle enough. Even the language of blessing began to shift. May you be remembered. Replace, may you be saved. Thank you for staying. Replace, thank you for praying. And when someone said, God, protect you, they often meant the woman with the herbs, or the boy who could make clean water, or the elder who watched from the window and kept names alive by saying them aloud. You heard whispers that perhaps the saints now were among the living, that perhaps holiness could be mortal, that perhaps the divine had not left you in your grief, but had crouched beside you in the form of those who wash your wounds and did not run. Clergy, when they returned, found their places changed. They were still welcomed, but often asked to listen more than speak. When they preached, they were asked to name the dead, to thank the living. When they gave communion, people sometimes asked that it be shared also with the old man in the back, the one who could not kneel but had kept the fire burning through the worst nights. You understood gradually that faith had not died. It had changed shape. It had come down from the heights and begun to walk among the kitchens, the sick rooms, the empty streets. It had clothed itself not in robes, but in aprons, not in relics, but in calloused hands, not in scripture alone, but in the names people remembered because they could not afford to forget. And while you still lit candles at the altar, you also lit them at doorsteps. You still spoke the ancient words, but now you added your own, names of those who had held you, fed you, stayed beside you. And when you looked to heaven, it was no longer only for a paradise after death, but for the strength to do right by the living here, now, again, in the stunned stillness that followed the dying, when bells no longer rang, because there were too few hands to pull them, when no one knew exactly how many had perished because the counters themselves had fallen ill, and when towns and farms alike held more memory than voice, it became clear that someone, anyone, had to begin writing again, not with the solemnity of monastic scriptoria, nor the flourish of legal decree, but with the urgency of survival, of reconstruction, of keeping track not of saints or kings, but of bread, of births, of what remained, You had never been taught to write in the way the priests had, with illuminated margins and divine intent. You had learned your letters from a half-burned primer, found in the rubble of a collapsed schoolhouse. And your hand had steadied not through training but through repetition, copying names from headstones, inventory from abandoned shops, and debts recorded on scraps of cloth now deemed precious. No one appointed you. No one anointed your hand with oil or declared you worthy of the task. But one day, someone said, "You can write, can't you?" and handed you a list of those who had not returned from the fields. You copied the names, each one pausing your breath, each letter a small funeral. And when that list was read aloud and heads nodded in solemn recognition, you realized that what you had done was not merely clerical. It was sacred in a new way, not because God had decreed it, but because the village had agreed to remember through you. After that, the requests never stopped. Write the names of the orphans. Write the claim for the widow who has no sons. Write the contract for the tools now shared by 6 families. Write the map of which fields still grow barley and which now yield only weeds. You became, almost without realizing it, the ledger of your community's breath. Each mark a pulse, each line a heartbeat. You wrote in barns and kitchens, on the backs of old sermons, on the blank pages of holy books that now bore grocery lists and chore schedules. You sharpened charcoal when ink ran out, mixed ash and spit when paper grew scarce, and pressed marks into leather, into bark, into skin when no other surface could be found. And in doing so, you turned your village into a book, not bound by cover or ruled by genre, but held together by the thread of record. When disputes arose, over boundaries, over inheritances, over what promised whom what, you were summoned not as judge, but as witness. Not because you were wise, but because you had written things down. And people began to defer not to lineage, nor to wealth, nor to faith, but to ink, what was written, remembered, and signed. Children watched you. They traced your letters in the dirt beside you. You began to teach, not from scrolls, but from bread wrappers, from the sides of broken crates. You showed them how to shape an A like a rooftop, a B like a belly, and they laughed, but they learned. Because now, to write was not just a record. It was to exist, to anchor oneself against a forgetfulness that had already claimed so much. Sometimes you copied the names of the dead. Sometimes the list of those born since. Sometimes the instructions for burying safely or growing onions, or how to distill water when the well soured. You wrote recipes, contracts, poems, warnings. A world was being rebuilt one sentence at a time. There was a day when you wrote a marriage contract between 2 survivors, neither young, both marked by loss. And when they signed their names, their hands trembling but steady, you realized that the act of writing had become a kind of vow, that they were building something again, and that you were its architect, its notary, its witness, its chorus. Your pages traveled. They were copied, carried, read aloud in distant farms. Someone wrote to you. We read what you wrote about the barley. It helped. And in that, you understood that the written word, once hoarded in monasteries and guarded behind Latin, had now become communal, practical, vital. You were not the only one. In towns and valleys beyond your own, others like you had picked up pens and coal and fingernails, carving meaning into whatever they could find. And though none of you wore robes, none of you had titles, you were writing the new world, not of laws, but of rhythms, not of empires, but of days, not kings, but of hands and hunger and hope. And perhaps someday, someone would come again in robes, with seals and proclamations, declaring history once more to be their domain. But for now, you held it, and you did not hold it for glory. You held it because someone needed to remember who lived, who planted, who forgave, who dared to start again. And you wrote it not in gold, but in ash, in breath, in the fragile Engel world just beginning to believe in itself again. For what felt like an endless stretch of seasons, when the air carried more names of the dead than scents of harvest, when entire neighborhoods disappeared without even the dignity of mourning, and when every new sunrise arrived not as promise but as uncertain reprieve, you believed, deeply, desperately, that you had lived through the unraveling of everything, through the final undoing of a world that could never be rewoven, through a silence so complete it seemed not just to mute the present, but to erase the very possibility of a future. You believed it in the way you stepped over rubble with reverence, in the way you avoided streets that used to hold festivals, in the way you found yourself whispering, even when no one was left to hush you. It felt like the end, not because the stars fell or mountains cracked, but because so many of the things that made the world feel familiar, voices, rituals, faces, meals, touch, had vanished so thoroughly, so indifferently, that you could no longer imagine what return could even look like. But then slowly, like a leaf emerging from charred soil, something different began to stir, not triumphant, not loud, not bright, but persistent. A child's laughter bounced off the stones of a cleaned alley. A wedding, small and imperfect, was held under the shadow of an unroofed church. A market reopened, even if half the stalls were empty, and someone argued passionately, playfully, over the price of salt. And in those moments, brief and fragile, you began to see that what you had thought was the end had merely been a threshold, that the collapse you had witnessed was not the world's death, but the shedding of an old skin, brittle and long overdue. You started to notice how things reassembled, not into what they were, but into what they needed to be. Families no longer built around blood alone, but around survival, around kindness, around the shared memory of who stayed. Communities redrew their boundaries, not by walls or titles, but by gestures, who shared their grain, who sang through sorrow, who learned to hold space for grief without being broken by it. Even the word normal ceased to mean what it once did. Where once had been synonymous with order, with hierarchy, with things in their proper place, it now came to mean, can we make space for each other? Can we live gently inside a world that remembers how fragile it is? You notice that the stories people told had changed, too. Not only what was said, but how it was told. There was less boasting, less triumph. Fewer endings where the hero stood alone in glory. Now, the hero was the one who came back. The one who carried another. The one who forgave. The one who planted after burying. The one who remembered names long after others had moved on. And these were not tales of epic conquest, but a quiet, enduring presence. You finally understood that what had ended was not the world, but a version of it that believed itself invulnerable, immutable, ordained. The world of unquestioned obedience. The world of unshared power. The world where holiness could only be robed, and knowledge only written in Latin, and worth only bestowed by birth. That world you saw now had cracked not only under the weight of the plague, but under its own illusions. And from that ruin, people were not just rebuilding homes and markets and rituals. They were rebuilding meaning. You, who had once kept records out of necessity, now saw yourself as a witness not just to survival, but to redefinition. You no longer just wrote what happened. You wrote what mattered. You wrote who apologized, who changed, who dared to hope, who chose tenderness, even when bitterness would have been easier. And as you walked through the streets that had once been abandoned, where weeds now shared space with seedlings, where silence had given way to new dialects and blended songs, you felt in your bones a truth that could not be preached, only lived. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a world where nothing could be taken for granted. Not time, not breath, not bread, not each other. And if someone were to ask you now what changed most after plague, you would not point to the empty mansions or the cracked cathedrals or the faded banners. You would point to the way people listened longer, touched more gently, argued more kindly, grieved more openly. You would point to the way silence was no longer feared, but honored, to the way the smallest things, names spoken aloud, a pot of soup shared, a lullaby hummed to no one, had come to carry the weight of all that once seemed unreachable. You finally understood the end had already come, yes, but not as punishment. So now, the streets are quieter, not because they're empty, but because people learn to speak more gently, to move with more care, to let doors close slowly rather than slam them shut. And in this new rhythm of living, bread is not merely eaten, but broken and shared, passed from hand to hand like memory made edible, while by the fire, a cat curls into a silent question mark. And somewhere, someone sings, Not for ritual, not for worship, but because silence itself seems to ask for a song to soften it. There are no more horns to sound, no more banners to lift, only candles, small and flickering, glowing from windowsills and corners and hearts, and only names, spoken softly before sleep, carried like lullabies over rooftops and fields. And now, you too may lie down, not out of exhaustion, but because the world is no longer collapsing. It is exhaling. Close your eyes. Let your breath fall into the rhythm of peace. Someone is still tending the fire. The ink has dried. The page has turned. You are safe. You are remembered. You are home. The end. Good night.